Welcome to the Pier-Glass Poetry Panels. I'm your host, Stan Galloway, and I want to thank you for joining us again. Today we're going to be looking at poetry and social awareness. Our first guest is Neal Hall, a trained medical surgical eye physician and graduate of Cornell and Harvard universities. An internationally acclaimed poet, he has composed poetry and performed readings throughout the United States and internationally in such places as Kenya, Indonesia, France, Jamaica, Morocco, Canada, Nepal, Italy, Ghana, Japan, India, and Germany. He's an award winning author of 7 books of poetry, most recently, Trembling on the Tiber. Cornell West said, "He is a warrior of the spirit, a warrior of the mind, an activist, a poet." I sense Dr. Hall's hypersensitivity to suffering. Martin, Malcolm, and Jesus all had this hypersensitivity. Both sides of his soul have prophetic leanings. His poetry has the capacity to change ordinary people's philosophy on social and racial issues. You can find him at nealhallpoet.com. We're happy to have you here today.
Thank you. It's not that we love truth less, but that we love living the lie more. Under the pretense of perfection constantly in the making, we the people, in order to appear to be constantly forming a more perfect union, falsely pretend and profess to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty, and that all men abide by these deeds except those we the people. 'Tis but marrow from feigned feeble tongues. There is but one mind in all these we the people, and it is bent. Men construing things after their own fashion, clean from the purpose of the thing itself. 'Tis but common proof of lowliness. Colorable, they say there is no Black America, no white America, no Latino America, no Asian America. There are but these bent states united in a we the people America. More marrow from feigned feeble tongues of what they say and not what they do when they live what they do. We, the people, point a finger on the water's surface and call it the moon, clean from the purpose of the thing itself. America was built on fear, not on courage, not on imagination, not on an unbeatable determination to not point its finger on the water's surface and call it the moon. Clean from the purpose of this thing itself, let us start with what America calls the truth, to now call it a lie. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. Shrunken from these measures, it's not that we love truth less, but that we love living this lie more. "911. Swore solemnly he to those who serve as keeper of peace, to faithfully do no harm, to uphold and safeguard the sanctity of life, to shield and protect communities for those who would seek to cause their harm. Swore solemnly he to be guided by love of service to community and the grace of humanity in service to members of the human family, worthy of dignity and respect. But I dialed 911 on this one. I called the police on the police to protect us from the police. Dialed 911 on one of the many they want us to believe is just one of a few. Dialed 911 because one of them in the course of upholding and safeguarding the sanctity of life, committed murder upon one of us, called the police on the police with a badge, a gun, and reckless contempt for blackness and black bystanders pleading, telling the keeper of peace to lift his knee from the neck. Who were we to dare tell him what to do, even if that doing was brazenly, blatantly, openly murdering a black man because the policeman had a badge? He had a gun. He had by white entitlement and privilege to systemic discretion to shield and protect members of the human family as he saw fit, worthy of dignity and respect. So now I, keeper of the peace, inextricably bound by duty, tied by obligation, guided by love of community, compelled by the grace of our common humanity, to serve and protect against heinous, felonious, knees to the neck. I dialed 911 on this one, called the police on the police to protect us from the police committing murder upon one of the many of us, keeping his knee kept to our neck. The forest for the tree. We have missed the forest for the tree in its most favorable light if we buy the lie that the majority of all the wrongful black killings are perpetuated by a few bad apples that have fallen from the rotten apple tree, and that the majority of police hanging from that rotten tree are good fruit. What say we? What do we to the majority of alleged good apples that hang silently, doing nothing to stop the majority of killings by an alleged minority of bad police? What accountability, culpability do we demand for indefensible, horrific silence to murder? Missing the forest for the tree, we revel in revelry of Chauvin's conviction when the real victory is not in the conviction of Chauvin. It's in the prosecution, conviction, and sentencing of the other three majority police who stood silently by, enablers, culpable accomplices, saying nothing, doing nothing, responsible and accountable for murder by an alleged minority of police. Chauvin is the tree, not the victory. The victory is in the conviction of the other three, and the majority like them to ensure the policing of the police by the police to preserve and protect us from the police. Chauvin is not the victory. He is the minority, the tree. And in our revelry, we have missed the forest for the tree. I was in Germany and I finished reading, and a woman in the audience said to me, "It takes time for change." And it tore my heart open. Time to change. Time tied to time. She said, change is tied to time and takes time, and thus it takes time for us to change. But the oppressed asked, who is us? And whom among us tied change to time? Why does it take time? And whose time? Who is the one taking time, needing time to take their time to change? The clock has been ticking since 1776. Whose watch do we watch when we are not the watch, nor the watcher of the watch? Whose watch do we watch to keep the time we keep residing this side of tyranny? Who gets to be the timekeeper, taking their time, watching time to say now? It's the time to say now. It's the time to make real the promises of freedom and democracy, tied to time, tied to watches and watchers of watches that are not mine, that tie change to time. And I used to be Troubled by religion. I'm no longer troubled by religion. Shepherded sheep. We are shepherded sheep, daydreaming in fallow fields of dreams and fallow fields of build it. And the fools of faith will come to kneel before it. This one thing called by two names, this double dealing back to back double face of evil, haloed and horned, adorned in black and white, whose intersecting edges bleed gray to make sure the fools of faith lose their way. This one thing called by two names, this father and son double dealing, separating us into secular and non-secular, double dipping us, pitting us against us to kill us one by one till thine kingdom be done. Double dealing deities and devils, dealing heavens and hells that do not exist, myth and tales that tell us to bend the knee before devils and deities, double dealing and selling heavens and hells that do not exist. We are shepherded sheep, layered in layers of doomsday lies and lies of everlasting life beyond this life by anointed, appointed listeners, hearing the call of their calling to call us to bow the head and bend the knee to offer up offerings to an economy of Trinity, selling heavens and hell, selling freedom from fears by playing to our fears. It is but this one thing, this Trinity called by two names, this double-faced jewel of biblical piracy, of biblical proportion, pilfering, pulling the wool over the foolish eyes of sheep to fleece and rob them of their wool. We are shepherded sheep, daydreaming in fallow fields of dreams and fallow fields of build it, and the fools of faith will come to kneel before it. And I'll leave you with this last one. I wanted to say something about critical race theory. Intellectually, morally, legally, scholarly, you self-servingly get and teach critical Italian, critical Irish theory. You get and teach critical Jewish, Armenian, Polish, French, and English theory. You get critical poor white and white female theory, set in play to create and maintain institutionalized social, political, and economic inequalities against you. But you just can't get your arms around critical race theory because your hands are all over it. And it's what you've done and not what was done to you. You can't get your arms around it because your hands are all over it. Thank you.
Thank you, Neal. As always, your words are powerful, and often I need to sit and think as the words just keep on coming in. So I appreciate what you had to share for us today. Let's look now at our second poet for today. Aimee Suzara is a Filipino-American poet, playwright, and performer based in Oakland, California. Souvenir, her first book of poetry, was published in 2014 by WordTech Press. Her mission is to create and help others create poetic and theatrical work about race, gender, and the body to provoke dialogue and social change. Her work has been presented nationally, selected for the Utah Arts Festival, 1 Minute Play Festival, United States of Asian America, and supported by the National Endowment for the Arts, among other grantors. She can be found at aimeesuzara.net. We're so glad that you could join us today.
Thank you. Thanks, and good to see everyone. Thanks, Neal, for your sharings. I have a few selected, but I'm going to kind of talk weaving into what I'm saying, what I'm reading, to frame kind of around this theme of like social action, social justice, and why I picked them. The first poem is, I wrote over the past year, and performed a couple times, has not been published yet, but has been featured, it kind of emerged out of, during the pandemic, a lot of what arose was attention to hate crimes and more vivid discrimination against Asian Americans. And a lot of it happened actually where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. There was actually a man who, just literally around the corner, there's a little altar for a man who passed away, who was killed during this time frame. It was an elder who was taking a walk at 6 something in the morning. And, I think it also made me think a lot about like this category of Asian, and also some of I could really go into it, the divisions that were coming up among different communities around these crimes. And so for me, it really pointed to the fact that there's so much lack of understanding of the variety of Asian groups and who makes up this huge, gigantic group of people living in California, especially. And I don't even normally say, hey, I'm Asian American, this is my identity. I really focus on being Filipino. This month, October, is Filipino American History Month. But in this moment, it felt really important to kind of show my solidarity with this giant grouping of Asian. And so let me make sure I have my timer on, because I could talk and not do my poems. So I thought about, what is it that we need to do around all of this? There's a lot of division, there's misunderstanding. There was sort of like groups that were, there was some oppression Olympics kind of things happening. And what I felt was really important was to illuminate the fact that a lot of it is about invisibility, lack of discussion, lack of understanding, and lack of even ourselves seeing ourselves. So the poem is called Not a Silent Film. And I ended up focusing on popular media because it made me reflect on, growing up, what was my visibility to myself and to others, and lack of. So this is called Not a Silent Film. Okay, I'm lost my face. Okay. I want to watch a movie where the Asian characters are not silent, where the Asian character does not have a high-pitched, tiny voice or no voice or an accent that does not match her supposed ethnicity, where the entire joke is not how quiet she is, where all the white people make faces and stare at each other and say, shrugging to the other white people as though she is not there, I hear nothing. In the 4th grade, I went to the county fair with my white best friend, and we wore cowboy hats with blue feathers tucked in. I do not want to watch a movie where each Asian person represents her entire race. I do not want to have to feel so appreciative that at least the Filipino character is not a model minority, but is in fact an idiot. In the 6th grade, I stared at the mirror and pinched my nose and wanted blue contacts and blonde bleached hair like the Vietnamese cheerleader who got into the popular crowd. In the 6th grade, I learned ching chong and you stink and discovered I was pretty for an Asian girl. I am tired of seeing a Korean actor have to use a Japanese accent to portray a Vietnamese character. I'm tired of seeing the Filipino actor have to portray a Mexican character. I'm tired of the Filipina actress claim Hawaii but not her bloodline because it is more exotic. I'm tired of the Filipina being the nanny. In the 11th grade, I brought my family to the Renaissance Fair, and we tried on bodices and skirts, and I felt something was wrong, but did not quite think a Filipino would never wear this or be here during the Renaissance. I want to watch a TV series all the way through and not grimace when an Asian person is misrepresented, which is an inevitable, non-intended plot twist that no one notices. I want to watch something where I am not fragmenting myself in order to relate to a part of a remotely similar character because I do not exist. Like sometimes I can relate to a woman, a Latina, an immigrant, or a queer person. I want to watch a character I relate to without breaking myself into pieces. I want to watch a movie where the Filipina is the center of everything and beautiful and strong and has romances with men or women or whomever she would like, has a well-rounded personality, a powerful voice, and flaws, but none of them is that she is shy or cannot get friends due to her A+ work ethic. I'm afraid of disappearing. I want to watch a movie and relax, lean back and enjoy the show, knowing it is for me, for my laughter, for my pleasure, not at my expense. I want to buy some popcorn and just laugh and order all the butter and large overpriced Diet Coke and gummy worms just because I want to. This movie will be so loud, the walls will crack. Okay, so that's my first poem. So this is called Amphibious, and oh gosh, I have to frame it a little bit. So it's part of a new series and a new manuscript exploring the encounters of Filipino natives with Spanish and other European colonists. So this is going back into history, and it's part of sort of my recent manuscript that I've been working on for a few years. I had a child in the middle of all this, so it's been taking an extra double, triple time to complete this manuscript, but he's part of the process too. So, but the book is, and this poem is using archival text from the 16th to early 17th century, and it references archival historic texts, and it also uses Tagalog, Spanish, and English intertwined. So it's a trilingual poem, and sort of some of the history, the background is that the conquest of the Philippines in 1565 by Spain, and then this is kind of referencing that and sort of looking at early interactions, imagined interactions between Spanish and Filipino native people. So that's sort of the project here. It starts with a quote. It's called Amphibious. Quote, "These people, both men and women, seem amphibious and to be able to live on water as well as on land. So well do they swim and dive. 5 pieces of iron were thrown into the sea to them for the pleasure of seeing them exercise themselves. One of them was skillful enough to get all 5 of them, and in so short a time that one can regard it as marvelous." Observations of indigenous Filipinos by the Dutch in 1600 from Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas by Antonio de Morga. To be amphibious is to breathe underwater, gills and fins illuminated in a flash of sun. To be sirenos es amar el mar, es tener cuerpos de agua, disfrutar how the sea dances along our spines, how it fills our hair, makes us weightless. We do not care if we are seen, taken as entertainment, desnudos, observados en un acto sagrado. Our brown bodies split the water, no para conquista, kundi para sa unión. Our bangka are extensions of our katawan ng tubig. Do you know which hands carved this wood? Mula saang mga puno, whose spirits guide us to the other side? Hindi namin kailangan ng mga mapa. Hindi namin kailangan ng mga kumpas. Feel the immense dagat move beneath us. Can you feel it through the thick hulls of your conquering vessels? We do not disrupt the harmony of things. Can you plunge your hand into the sea and bring up a fish? Can you split one into 2,000 pieces so that every mouth is filled? Can you perform such the miracles you describe in your holy book? Watched by mga Anito, todos los seres vivos nos protegen. Bawat plankton, bawat maliit na hipon, bawat nabubuhay na bagay. Ser amphibious, upang maging kasuwaton sa dagat, is to breathe underwater. So I know there's a lot of words that people don't understand. If you read the link, I can share the link. There's this was on the Poem a Day on poets.org. They did all the footnotes, but I think you probably got most of it through the context. Sirenos are mermen, that are part of both in the Filipino and Spanish mythological worlds. And it's like just like in the sirens or sirenos, the idea of the mermaid or merman is a tantalizing creature that leads fishermen to their deaths. But also in the more indigenous ideas, it's like they're spirit guardians of the sea. They're like encantos, and the indigenous and colonial concepts go into that idea. And then it's just sort of the other ones I won't. The banca, that's a good one. Banca is a boat, and it's a Filipino outrigger boat that has origins in ancient times. And a lot of the references I made are about the Anito, which are nature spirits. So that, I guess I wanted to share that, even though people can't see all the translations, because for me, social action is also about, kind of like the poem I shared before, is about creating visibility and working against narratives that erase and omit important stories. And in this case, for example, the colonial encounter between Spain and the Filipinos, it's very similar to places around the world when there were during the Spanish Empire, the discovery and the conquest and the Christianizing of Filipino natives. It sort of tells a story of colonialism around the world as well. And all of the literature that you can get is from Spanish friars and Spanish in the Spanish narrative about Filipinos. So when you're trying to understand people during that time, you get the exoticism and the description of them as like less than is embedded in the language. So how do we take that and try to imagine people that were actually already there and thriving and had communities and cultures and many languages and beliefs that we have to sort of like dig in and bring it back into the light. So that's kind of part of my social action with those kinds of poems. And then I'm running out of time, low on time. So I think my last thing I'll just share is, since it's Filipino American History Month, I really want to emphasize that, October. And it's Filipino American History Month, not heritage. So it's really about the Filipino presence in the United States and the Filipinos, what the influences as well as the struggles and challenges that have been faced by Filipinos in the United States. So I encourage people who are listening to look it up. The Filipino American National Historical Society, FONS, is a really great first stop to go. And I'll also say that on my Tumblr blog every day this month, I'm posting something about Filipino American history and sort of my own kind of processing and ranting and like excerpts of poems that I'm starting. And so I'll just close with something. This is also the 500th year anniversary of Ferdinand Magellan supposedly circumnavigating the globe. And so I just want to name that, he actually didn't make the circumnavigation. He was killed by the people of Lapu-Lapu, who was a datu or a leader in the Philippine Islands, who killed him. And yet somehow he turned out to be the hero that circumnavigated the globe. So I wrote a short kind of rant on my blog and it's called Philam History Month Notes Day 7. Because it is the 500th anniversary of Magellan's failed journey, and I am obsessed over Lapu-Lapu and my son's coloring book, aka Magellan was not a good guy. So this is just like a rant start to a poem. This year marks the 500th anniversary of Ferdinand Magellan's journey, which was actually a failed circumnavigation of the globe, because actually he didn't make it, but his possibly Filipino, definitely Southeast Asian, enslaved Enrique did. And so I'm feeling some kind of way. Side note, Enrique is the person who was his translator and he was treated as a slave. He did circumnavigate the globe, and Magellan didn't. Just as other conquistadors and explorers and colonizers who collected things and maps and gold and people from parts of the world that were already inhabited, then put their name on those said, already named, already self-owned and thriving communities, people, lands, and belongings, here we have Ferdinand Magellan, somehow, though apparently vicious to his own crew, killing them when they mutinied, treated as a traitor by Portugal, greedy, seeking his own island as a prize, and only able to communicate because of his enslaved Enrique, he failed to succeed in converting Datu Lapu-Lapu's people and died a pretty gory death, involving possibly a poisoned arrow or, in some accounts, a spear. I'm leaning towards this less pretty version, and was overcome by native warriors. Of course, we get is not 500 years after Magellan was defeated by indigenous people of the Philippines, aka the Battle of Mactan, but the heroic navigator who circled the globe. But who can be surprised by that? So that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Aimee, for reminding us of so many things, and in particular, the fact that monolinguists miss so much of the world. And so I encourage us all to consider the way that other people speak around us, whether that's with words or with other parts of their being. Okay, let's move on now to our third poet for today. Darlene Anita Scott is the girl you met the other day at the grocery store. She made you want to say something to her, and you did, and now you can't remember her name. But that wasn't really the important part of meeting anyway. A poet, visual artist, and professor of composition and creative writing, she lives in Richmond, Virginia, where even though she's too old to play on monkey bars, she does. Too young to remember Sam Cooke, but she listens to him anyway. Her first book, Marrow, will be released early in 2022, and you can find her at darleneanitascott.com. And of course, here with us today. Welcome, Darlene.
Hi, thank you, Stan. Thanks for having me. Thank you to all our guests, and certainly thank you to the poets. It's great to be in fellowship with you all this morning or this afternoon here. One of the things that I will say in preface to reading my poems, which I think is like this is perfect, the order that we went in is specifically as Aimee was talking about invisibility. When I'm thinking about social awareness, when I'm writing about social awareness, that's one of the things I'm writing about. And one of the things that was so important about this invitation and also I think with my writing is that it implicates me. Like I have to think about not only how I may be made invisible as a Black woman, but also how I might be making others invisible. And so the poems I'm going to read are about that invisibility and about what that means, what that says of us when we don't notice folks, right? So the first poem I'm going to read is called Watershed, and it's about a case that happened in 1991 when I was 15 years old. The young lady in the poem is also 15 years old, as you will hear. Her name is Latasha Harlins, and so some of you may be familiar with the case. What happened was Latasha, a 15-year-old girl, after school decides to go into a convenience store in LA where she lived. When she went to the convenience store, she goes to the back to the cooler, picks up some orange juice. The store owner believed that she was going to steal the orange juice. And as it turns out, she had the money in her hand to pay for the orange juice. However, the store owner shot her and she died. This case happened in March, which you'll hear in the title, March 16th, 1991. And this was around the same time as the Rodney King beating came to light. The video showed up. And so what happens is people start paying attention to Rodney King, but this young girl, her case is, even though many people know about it, there are many people who don't because it was largely overshadowed, in fact, by the Rodney King case. And so I want to think about, in this poem, how Latasha Harlins is kind of absorbed into history, if you will. We don't talk about her case very much, and where I was at 15 and how I implicate myself at the same age as her and was paying more attention to Rodney King in that case and not so much to this young girl who was, in fact, my peer. So the title again is called Watershed, March 16th, 1991, and it begins with a news story or with a clip from a news story that describes the case. This is not television. This is not the movies. This is real life. This was how Deputy District Attorney Roxanne Carvajal cautioned the jury before showing them the last seconds of Latasha Harlins' life as captured by security cameras on March 16, 1991. The video showed the 15-year-old girl first struggling with Soon Jadu, the owner of Empire Liquor Market in Delhi on South Figueroa Street, then walking away and finally falling down, having been shot in the head by Du. I imagine March 5th, 1991, while she was still abbreviation. I imagine myself, high on sugar, Rhapsody, a boy. I imagine the Black man canvas under police batons that mark him in symbolism, blotted all over my screen. Pretty sure I quickly memorized his name. I imagine March 16th, 1991, when ticker tape announced hers, first and last, that I began the reluctant task of dispensing the surprise of death into my 15-year-old imagination. I imagine that in her final seconds, it was surprise holding her upright before she crumpled into death. Surprise that 15 was it. Surprise at the lump in her throat that had been for 6 years her dead mother, that kept her company and quiet, yet moved like stone from tune to tell this woman on this day that she had no intention of stealing orange juice. Surprised maybe that legs trained on the track and in elaborate gumboot dances could not find power to escape heat so hot it was cool entering the back of her UCLA Bruins cap. The curl and the bang that tickled her neck, flattened under the flow and weight of blood that met and darkened her dark blue Dickies, or surprise that it was 1991. Urban legends, not newspapers and sound bites, recorded Black girl bodies as flimsy opportunities for entry, if they recorded them at all. Surprised that her Black girl body was about to be history. Maybe she heard her favorite music instead of the whistle that is the speed of life passing around and through all the Black girl bodies living and dying during that time, like mine, imagining Mrs. Jewell, the wooden boards of her corner store holding us barely. They creaked under the after-school weight of our bodies, brown as. Sassy with hunger and salty insults hurled in the direction of her veiled, mostly naked assaults, like spilling change on the counter to avoid contact with our skin. The women who knew, Mrs. Rosita, my grandmother, tried to bake and freeze us away from her store. I imagined they did not want us to fall into a death with surprise and didn't trust what entered us from her spotted hands. I imagined Tammy's skin, light like a beacon to boys, not as bright as the one I imagined she followed, having been raised Baptist. I imagined she was pregnant as the rumors hissed by one of those probably also hissing boys, and only as hot as any Black girl body that moves through life with such velocity, who hears music over the whistle and moves to it. I am not able to imagine if she held her body upright through the hemorrhage, whether it was big or little, or how it might have surged through her body like a bullet or the steadied pace of disease. When I remember Tammy, I only imagine myself, high on sugar, Rhapsody, and a boy, 15, abbreviated and impenetrable. So the next two poems that I write, or that I'm going to read, are Ars Poeticas, and they're really about, again, about girlhood, about Black girlhood, and about perhaps what we don't see when we see Black girls. So the first one is Ars Poetica as another dashiki. The girls we grew from are bamboo, persistent hallelujahs determined to reach the gods. We are zills of Fulani hammered brass, punctuating the slow turn of our necks that follows the eyes in our heads with deliberate precision. Latifa acolytes, we rip cellophane from chemical-scented Africa, made in China. $10 to be taller than any Bible school heaven, bloom into earths, our seeds swelling into a nation. Hold the colors to our chest like flags or armor, gum cracking like buckshots. And the second, which speaks of the monkey bars that you heard in my bio, which I continue to love as an adult, Ars Poetica of the monkey bars. How the metal bars wound the pads of our gripping fists, first calluses of warning, then blisters. how we are chided with stinging alcohol, how pus and blood soak white gauze with viscous defiance, how we won't retreat from the bars through to healing, how sky becomes ground. We own gravity. We own ourselves as long as our chaperones are assembled in Saturday best, a colorful caution tape of their big kid bodies containing the swell of them on a patch of asphalt they transform into rucker. It rips from dances to music that makes the afternoon bleed, how we regale our own blood, how our chests balloon, proud hemorrhages. And the last poem I'm going to read, again, I was talking about how I implicate myself and think about how I make people invisible, perhaps for my own convenience and comfort. And so this borrows its title again from a news story. The woman stopped struggling and appeared to go limp. I wake from the weekend of a man whose good morning is sultry as the azure of sky and sea he names home. Against my ear, his belly a restless tide to the metal of East Coast spit. There is Sports Center, then Mexico burning. A woman is bare-bottomed and cuffed into control. Where her head meets concrete, swell of voices press the edge of her temple. Infant fist insistent as a soon mama's belly, like a raised stamp, determined to make mystery of the womb a known world. Strange as today's warm rain on the heels of a steely blue and cloudless weekend, against our flesh, I listen for the sea, ear against his belly like the conch on his altar, like the concrete against her bare bottom, collecting her spit and pleas. There was a train carrying a 5-minute wait of freight before I could shape day into rent, sausages, and over. Monday will not deal. In the meantime, Mexico burns. A woman marries in fashion too hip to be hipster. Another's spirit dries into Cleveland, her head ground to concrete. Swelling at her temple, a tumor of voices refusing to leak, crowding into the swell. We tried to cover her bottom, they offer, like bus tokens, reasons and shrugs buoyant as a body in the sea, will hold in any US court of law. I type a combination of characters that insinuates the kisses I promise him. Tonight, we'll scroll over the restless tide of his belly. In the restlessness of my own, I'll change the channel. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. And again, I like listening to the smoothness of your contemplation in these poems, because there's a settledness in the way you present that belies some of the unsettledness of the content of the poems, and I think that works very well. So now we've heard from our poets, and there are many similarities, there are many differences in what we've had to say about poetry and its intersection with social awareness. And in particular, one of the things that I found interesting, though not unexpected, is that they are fairly well settled on the United States as the area of consideration, though Aimee does point out that that even something as simple as Filipino American extends far beyond California to New York as a boundary, that in many ways the whole globe impacts America, perhaps in some of the same ways that America impacts around the globe. And I wonder if any of the poets would like to talk about how their poetry or how their views of American culture might transcend the physical boundaries of America. In what ways are we speaking outside America as well as inside America in the poetry that we write?
I think you're talking, Neal.
Yeah, I had my mute. I'm sorry. I think at least for me, in my experience, in every way, having the opportunity to travel around the world, I see the same thing that's in America, in other parts of the world. It may be in a different language. It may have a cultural twist, but it is the same underlying cause. And to me, I figured out, at least for me, is that much of the ills of the world are largely based on man's need to a fear of not being able to live forever, to sustain himself, even if it was for a day back in the dinosaur days or whatever. And so he or she does everything they can to preserve themselves, even at the extent of harming their fellow man. And greed is one of the major tools that one utilizes in order to do this. Other tools that greed uses, is misogyny, the color of the skin, whether you're a Dalit, whether you're a Brahmin, whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Protestant, it's all the same thing. It's trying to find a way to have a leg up on someone else so that you can preserve yourself and live more comfortably. It is the same all over the world, no matter where you go. It's everywhere. Mm.
Thank you. Yeah, I think when you talk about greed as this universal, I think, and actually just to clarify, 2 of my 3 poems were actually based in the Philippines. The last 2 that were more about the Spanish conquistadores and the imperialism. But the reason why if I were to do it more as a whole body of work in terms of that work, I also tie that in with American colonialism, because the Philippines was colonized first by Spain for between 300 and 400 years, and then the United States for, we will say 100 years, including the military presence. So there's patterns of imperialism, and part of that, the patterns of imperialism globally, is subordinating the people that were native to that land, imposing belief systems, imposing language. So the United States did the same thing in terms of imposing English, imposing American schooling, and they did that to all of the colonies they took from Spain, right? So when there was Passover in 1898 from Spain to the U.S. imperial era, was Puerto Rico, Cuba to a degree, the Philippines, Hawaii, all of these places. So we saw American schooling and imposition of values and beliefs. And that is enabled because of a sense of white supremacy and this superiority complex that goes with imperialism. And that's global, right? It's been going on. Spain carried a lot of that originally to the Philippines. So the Philippines it's so ingrained. And I just wanted to say, why did I pick 2 poems about that took place in the Philippines? And then I said, Filipino American History Month, this is about the US. Well, it's about these narratives that we pass on to our children. It's the narratives that we teach people here to understand it is global. It isn't about like we just arrived and then we became, we could talk about early encounters in the Filipinos coming to the United States. The first arrival was supposedly 1521, I believe, when they jumped Spanish ships in Morro Bay. There's signs of Filipinos, but we could also talk about Filipinos being called the N-word and being compared to dogs and being killed by American soldiers like we were animals, put in cages. I wrote my book about that, the human zoos. And so we can talk about all that. But what I'm trying to say, what I want to do is say, my son, I want him to grow up reading about Lapu-Lapu and Magellan being not the hero, but actually the villain. I want him to learn that going back into generations, Filipinos were always resilient. And he comes with a rich, he's also Cuban and he's Afro-Cuban. So he has these three huge bodies of very resilient people that have dealt with enslavement, moving across the country in diaspora, being subjugated, but also persevering and making culture happen, right? And so I want him to understand that, but we don't read it. Like I grew up with reading about Cinderella and Snow White and I don't know, Elvis and, you know, who were my heroes? I didn't know about any of this growing up. So my passion is like for my child and for all the children to like understand in the United States where they come from, and they're going to be totally different. That, you know, they're going to experience a very different life than I did. Sorry, that was very long, but I'm really passionate about it. My son is 2.5, and I'm trying to really get him started with these coloring books and children's books. It's really important that we expose them, you know.
Yes, and that's exactly what I was thinking without being able to express it when I asked the question. So thank you, Aimee, for giving us that much broader context for that. Yeah, go ahead, Neal.
Unless Ms. Scott has something she wants to say about your original question.
No, you're good.
Okay, I think that's all good and fine, but so we know. So what does knowing do for us? We have knowing doesn't convey power. Power is what changes our situation. So knowing is not enough. In the medium of exchange of power, not only in America, but in the world, it's currency. And so unless we connect all that to power, the medium of a power, medium of exchange of power, from which we can begin to make real changes. Unless we make that connection, knowing is just knowing, and it's not enough. So we got to make that connection to empowering ourselves and knowing how to empower ourselves, because everything that's done to us is done in a way that empowers them. Mm-hmm. Whether they know their history or not, they know the history of the medium of exchange of power, and that being currency all over the world.
I think that also is grounded in what both Aimee and Darlene said about the silencing and the invisibility of people, and how that just seeing and hearing is the first step. Until that happens, there's no need to make a change. And as you're pointing out, Neal, the change needs to come. It's not enough just to hear and to see, but for many of us, that's where we have to start.
But Stan, I would argue is we've had 400 years, at least in this country, 400 years. How many more hundreds of years do we need in order to be first starting at being visible? We're visible enough. The question is, what do you do with that? We have $1.3 trillion in Black spending power. We are visible. The problem is 97% of that visibility is spent in the white community, enriching them. We are visible enough. You can't wait until you're 100% sure. 85% sure, pull the trigger. $1.3 trillion in Black spending power. We can change America overnight just by the way we spend our dollars. We don't need to wait another 400 years of visibility.
Go ahead. I see one of our audience members raising a hand. Go ahead and have a stay here. I think you're muted.
I am muted no longer. First things first. It takes a lot for me to be lost for words. Listening to you brilliant poets, visionaries has been outstanding. You've made a normal Monday and Saturday of running errands outstanding. Thank you so much. An honor, privilege, and a blessing. To the point of Neal Hall, not only is the spending power of the African American community actually 1.7 trillion, the combined spending power of all diverse people in this country is closer to $4 trillion. You are now talking about 3x of Canada. You are talking about the spending power of all of Central America, including Mexico. And so this has been unbelievably enlightening to me. Thank you again so much. And I'm all in as far as what's the next step, right? The next step. I mean, I think these readings are outstanding. I'm again, but what's the next step? How do we make sure that Aimee's 2-year-old grows up in an environment understanding all the aspects of his cultures? And how do we make sure that people who don't look like Aimee's kids or anybody who's on this call, how they get to understand it too? Complete knowledge is good for everybody, right? And so again, the next step is leveraging the trillions of dollars of spending power that as a combined group that we have, because that's the only way. The folks who deliver the narrative that Ferdinand Magellan was this great person, other people have the money. That when you got the money, you can make the message. Just ask Coke. Nobody in their right mind would drink Coke if you actually sat down and read the ingredients, right? Nobody would drink it, but Coke really understands how to deliver that message. So that's just my thoughts. Again, let me end where I started, which was thank you so much for your unbelievable, powerful words. And Stan, thanks for putting this all together. And I'm going to keep my mouth shut. I moved beyond words, and I've said a bunch. I guess that must be related to Aimee, huh? So thank you.
Very good. Who would like to continue?
I feel like I'm totally like, Darlene, please cross over me, but I'm feeling I want to like add, I'm putting some in the chat because I feel like it's, yes, Neal, I hear you. And I think also let's recognize there's different challenges faced by different communities, obviously, on this call. And for me, I think recognizing that Filipinos, specifically someone like myself, has to work on decolonizing is so much a part of our like inheritance that many of us, I would say myself, I look to a lot of Black writers. I've written essays about this. My solidarity with Black writers has been because of the visibility that I've seen. Like Audre Lorde is like my big hero, and also Latina writers like Gloria Anzaldúa. Filipino writers have not like made that kind of presence in the United States to the point of I grew up surrounded by understanding who these models were. So I think that there's different depending on the communities, and we are similarly part of a similar kind of, if we're talking about flipping white supremacy and capitalism and all of these systems, then what you're talking about, I agree. And I think for, I'm not probably not there yet. Like my strength is I'm an educator. I teach at a university. I teach creative writing, but I'm all about it. Like I need to work on my economic power, you know, the lack of intergenerational wealth, being of an immigrant family, the lack of feeling a sense of scarcity from that I inherited and feeling like I don't belong, right? That's another struggle that depending on like who our communities, like for me, I might represent more of like more recent immigrant communities. And most of my students, I teach at San Francisco State. So many of my students, we serve, my particular program serves first generation students in college, and their parents mostly immigrated if they were not immigrants themselves from Mexico, El Salvador, Philippines, mostly Latin America, but a lot of other places. And so we have students who are like, I have this pressure, I'm the first one to go to college, and they get overwhelmed, and they also go through mental health problems, largely because their parents are not able to necessarily help them in certain areas, but their parents went through this major trauma, right? So it's like how do we build cultural capital, which starts by giving us this sense of empowerment, what we bring from our backgrounds, our ancestries, wherever we come from. And then what, to me, it's the next goal is like economic power and all of that. So it's sort of like, I agree with you, Neal. And I feel like, I think my lane personally is like the education empowerment part.
Yeah, it's not to say that only one road leads to Rome. It's to say, from my perspective, the largest road, the widest road is the economic empowerment. And it's not to say that all these other issues, culturally or whatever, are not important. They are important. They will always be there. But how do we get down this road so that there's a sense of more equality, and we can focus on some of these other things too? I have this this thing where I make it short, the 10 Commandments. I love the 10 Commandments. I used to watch it all the time. Charleston Heston standing there before the nation of Jews and getting ready to take them to the promised land. But he pointed his butt to the people and his eyes to the promised land. Even though all these other issues were within the Jewish community at that time, somebody had to understand, there's the promised land. That's how we are going to make it. Because we're subjugated for one reason and one reason only, economics. So is economics the problem? Economics is the solution to our problem. And that's where more of us have to focus more on that. And again, you can't wait until you got 100% of your culture, this or that. You got to start now. It's been 400 years. Malcolm X said, we need to come together. The one thing that we have in common in their eyes, irrespective of all our different cultures and what we bring to it, all the religions, there's one common thing we have in their eyes. We're Black. And we need to let that unite us and our dollars to free us. And then we can be more than just Black. We can be Filipino. We can be Latino. We can be whatever. But if we don't, it'll be another 400 years.
Another thing that we all have in common is that we are poets on this call. And I just wonder if we might say what kind of currency as poets do we have that may be different from the other dollars that are being spent?
I'll start because I haven't said anything anyway. I think the currency that we have, and I think this is the currency of all artists, is that we're the observers and we're the recorders. So when we talk about all the conversation that we've had so far, for instance, like our job is to observe that and then to record it and disseminate it, right? Like that's what artists do. They look at all the nuances, all the little parts. I often hear people say, they'll hear a feature, an image in a poem, and they'll say, I never thought of it that way. Like I never saw that particular thing. And that's how I see my role, at least as an artist, as a poet, is to be the person who not only is looking at all the nuance, all the small details, but is also writing them down, also recording them, and then ultimately, of course, disseminating them. So I mean, speaking to the issues that we've talked about, like Aimee talks about visibility, I talk about visibility, we talk about this idea of visibility, and I think, and I'm going to mess this quote up really bad, but she said, I don't want to disappear. And this idea that we don't want the history, we don't want the culture to disappear. And then to speak to something Neal was saying, like we're all Black, for instance, like, and then we can be this, we can be Filipino, we can be Mexican, we can be all these things. Well, I think our job as artists, as poets, is also to write what that means. Because we know that it's not monolithic. Like we know it's not only one way to be anything. And so here we are as those people who are super observant, who are noticing all these nuances and all these details, so we can record that. And then we start to move into this direct action that I think Neal is leaning into as he talks about economic action and economic power and so forth. But, you know, I'm not an economist, not an accountant, not particularly good with my own money, right? You know what I mean? Like, you know, so what can I do? When Aimee's language was my lane is as an educator. So my lane is not only as an educator, for instance, like Aimee, I'm also a professor. I also teach. What do I do inside of that role if I'm not the clinician, like say Neal, right? If I'm not the technician, like Morgan on this call, right? I play my role, and in my role, I decide what I'm supposed to do. So as an artist, to go back to what I originally said, as an artist, I think our role, our lane, as it were, is to observe and to write that down, and to disseminate it to the masses so that then they can see all those things that maybe they didn't see before.
And see, I think that's my second role. My first role is to do that to me, for me. First, freeing myself so that I can do what you just so elegantly said to do.
I love that also love how you summed it up, Darlene. And the observation documentation, like this is a concrete, I mean, it's not a small role because, you know, think about all of these, you know, look about textbooks that have been banned, you know, books that have been banned in schools and in Arizona, like the ethnic studies being, you know, shut down, attacked. Education is like children are learning, like, what is the world that I'm entering and where am I going to participate? And if they're learning in a way that omits themselves or that they feel it continues to carry on that lack of like empowerment in terms of like seeing that I am a big player, a much bigger player than I ever thought, you know. I'm going through that freeing myself, Neal. Still, I think it's a lifelong process because I didn't learn any of this stuff growing up, and not to blame my parents because they were busy trying to figure out how to adjust to a new country, you know, and they were being discriminated against and they just swallowed that. I'm like the other person that's like coming out like, and then my son, who knows where he's going to be at, you know what I mean?
But don't say your parents short. What they were doing, they were figuring out a way, among other ways, to economically survive.
That's true. That's true.
Okay, that's what they were doing. And each and every one of us get up every morning and we go, even though we want to say we're an educator or we're a doctor or whatever. One of the primary reasons we go and do that is because we expect a check, economic survival.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's not hold the struggle for freedom, our freedom, your freedom, my freedom, to a lesser standard. There's a strong economic component to it. We must bring that to the forefront because you bring it to the forefront of your life every day by getting up and going to work and getting a paycheck, amongst the other things that you do. Freedom is not free. It has a price to obtain it and a larger price to sustain it. And
maybe, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, please.
I was gonna say, maybe there's this, what you did when you just pointed out my parents, because I think sometimes I'm still grappling with how to talk about what they had to do to assimilate, what they had to do to economically have their success. They sacrificed one or the other, but the difference is we don't have to leave our identities behind and at the same time achieve economic success. And they believed in an American dream that said, don't teach your children your native tongue because they won't succeed. Don't keep your identity, you know, hide that because it's less than. But the difference is, can we, you know, bring it along and work on economic success, bringing it together. And that's the project that their generation like didn't understand or didn't feel they were allowed to do. And so they brought me up not teaching me my own language. I lost it in one generation, but I believe my language can help me. And my son's other language, Spanish, I'm now more fluent in Spanish than I am in Tagalog. is going to help me and my son gain more economic opportunities instead of it being a detriment, which is what our prior generation was taught. You know what I mean?
Yes, but as long as you bring all that together, and the focus, the larger focus is not just, in my mind, on visibility, on culture and things like that. I mean, and we of color are not the only people who have done that. If you look at the Irish, they came over, they gave up their brogue. Other people who were subjugated, not necessarily based on ethnic or their color, but on other things, and they were able to sort of change those things. They did those for economic survival. They did it for economic survival. Once they became somewhat of an economic power, then they could go back or amplify those things even more with respect to their culture. We are not there. I am so annoyed by Black Lives Matter, these symbols, full of sound and fury and signifying nothing. Birds with wings just fly. They don't have to say, they got feathers. And so for us to have to yell Black Lives Matter, because Black lives don't matter. And we should start there first to make Black lives matter. And how do we do that? How's the best way to do that? And that's economic empowerment, because that's the reason why many of us do not matter. Because when we don't, it's an economic gain for somebody else.
Can I say, I think there are two things to what you just said, Neal. The first one was you said, oh man, please don't let me lose it.
That's why I write it down.
Right, I know. I usually. Okay, so but anyway, let me start on the second one because I can't remember the first one was. I should have written it down, but I'm listening intently. But when you're saying about Black Lives Matters, I think one thing, and it being annoying, like my question is always, who are you talking to when you direct your language? So like, we're told in general composition, one of the lessons that we're taught is audience, like know your audience. And so identify your audience, and then that will determine your purpose and how you move through the essay. And I think the same thing might be true. This might be the direction you're heading in when you say Black lives don't matter, because I don't think they don't matter. But I think the question is who are we directing that message to? Like, who are we saying Black Lives Matter to? Are we saying it to ourselves as an affirmation? As Black people, are we saying to ourselves, remind myself every day I look in the mirror, you matter, you're important? Or are we saying to a larger society, I want you to believe that I matter, and so I'm telling this to you as kind of a directive. So I think it's important that that when we hear that symbolism, particularly that language, not the symbolism, but the language, Black Lives Matters, then the consideration has to be, who exactly is that? Like, is that a sentence? Is that a question? Is that an affirmation? Is that a request? Who exactly is our audience when we make that, when we use that language? And I still haven't remembered what the first thing was that I was supposed to be asking about, but maybe I'll remember it later. But anyway, that's my comment on that.
For truth, the whole world is the audience for truth. Period. If it's the truth, it's for everybody. And so you have to decide whether it's the truth or not. But it's not, I don't believe that Black lives don't matter, but I don't believe just saying it is going to free me. To what end? To what end do we make Black lives matter? And it won't happen because I can sit and quote that I'm from Nigeria and I grew up in this colony in New Nigeria and blah, blah, blah. It's not going to do anything at all. Not to the people that matter and matter over us.
Yeah, Biff, do you want to jump in one more time?
Yes, thank you. So I think another poet from the 1980s, everybody in the call, well, y'all are too young to know who the 80s were, so you can Google it later. The poet laureate Randy Newman said, "It's money that matters." And if you get a chance to Google his poem, it's done with music and a melody behind it. It speaks to, what Neal is saying, it speaks to something that I agree to. Until you have money, nothing matters. Nothing matters. You're just screaming into the hurricane. And I think it's good that all of us preach the choir, the deacons and the visiting pastor. I watched a lot of things about, hashtag Stop Asian Hate. That was on many panels about that stuff. Well, I'm already convinced. I don't go out and beat up Asian people. I don't go out and beat up everybody, right? So it's not the people who are already convinced that we need to stop Asian hate or we need to understand the Me Too movement or anything else. It's the people who don't get it. Those are the folks that we need to talk to. And the people who don't get it, the only language they understand is money. They don't understand anything else. Don't care. Affect their money, affect their paycheck, you affect change. You make change with dollars. I think. I just do. You only make change with dollars. So maybe there's another way, but that's the only way that I know. All right, that's enough. No more from me. But thanks again, everybody.
Martin Luther King.
I think you should talk more. I also would love to hear some of the other folks too. That's just I'm just curious about other folks' thoughts too.
Anybody?
Go ahead, Neal.
Martin Luther King is one of my favorite persons to read about. And there was a speech, I can't remember which one it was, I Have a Dream speech. And what we hear, what is sold to us is the last third of that speech. And the beginning. What is not sold to us is that middle third of that speech. I discovered it about 3 weeks ago listening. And basically what Martin Luther King said at that time, he said, we can free ourselves. I'm paraphrasing. We can free ourselves now. We have $1 billion in economic spending power. Not only did he didn't stop there, he named the corporations that we should stop buying stuff from. Siltest, Coca-Cola, and it was Wonder Bread. That's what he said. And the next day they shot him dead. Because he was that close to how we can free ourselves. That's what he said. And that's what they don't tell us. So, if I'm your oppressor, I'm happy if you're going back looking, in Nigeria to find out where you came from and all that kind of stuff, because I keep going to the bank.
And we don't have everyone listening to us, much as I would love that. Sometimes I think that we are poets shouting into the hurricane that was said just a moment ago, and that just because I am shouting into a hurricane doesn't mean I'm going to stop doing it, because I can do that. As a poet, that's what I can do. And as Neal has pointed out, I can choose where I spend my money. I can choose how I live my life in a lot of different ways. And as poets, as Darlene has pointed out to us, we get to observe and we get to shape the visibility of people and cultures that have not had visibility by the virtue of our language. And our language might not be English, or we might have a small audience that speaks Swahili or Zulu or Uzbekistani, whatever the languages are. But we speak to those, we record to those who are able to hear us. And that isn't always the people we want. Go ahead, Aimee.
I have a thought. So I was thinking about Gil Scott-Heron, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, and sort of like how I use that poem a lot. That it's sort of like we're also in a world where young people especially, but a lot of people are just super affected by social media, especially during the pandemic. And so there is a way in which we're also like language has a specific currency right now, language sharing of like, for sharing our poems and all this stuff, people are doing this in different methods right now that can be broader than going through the needle, through threading the needle. We're going through the publishing agencies and all that. But I also wanted to say, you know, and Darlene, you and I teaching in university settings, two things I want to say. One is poets and educators are not paid enough. And that's a real economic challenge that I keep thinking about, Neal, as you're talking. I'm going, I don't, you know, I feel like a stress around finances, but I can attribute that partly to being, you know, coming from immigrant parents also, where we don't have intergenerational wealth that's built, but also mindset. Like a lot around economics is about like mindset, what you do with your money, where you put your money. And so I think there's just a lot of, I think as educators, a lot of that is what I work with my students is around like trying to get over their traumas and like economic, like a paralysis that a lot of us can have around money, and moving past that and wanting them, they're going to get jobs that pay them a lot better than I'm getting paid. You know what I mean? Like they are already, a lot of my students are like, I had a student, I was teaching at a community college, and they were like, I'm working at Facebook. Like they were like 20 years old. And I was going, they're earning more than I am, teaching them this class in composition or whatever to help them get these jobs. So I feel like education plays a really important role of getting people into the workforce. That's why it's really important to me to focus on students of color primarily, to take over some of these systems, and they're going to be way more wealthy than I am, which is good. But I also think it's a bad thing when we think about how low poets and educators, especially adjunct, I'm an adjunct, and how arts are underpaid. Like we shouldn't have to have 3 different careers and then write in between the cracks. And I'm also a single mom, you know, so it's like I'm raising my son, and writing is something I don't even have time to do, but I know that it's something I'm supposed to do. So this is also a very important thing. And nobody likes to talk about money in the United States. I teach a class in social justice, in public health, social justice, ethnic studies in this program. And we talk about that. We say like, nobody wants to talk about money. There could be a millionaire, billionaire person sitting next to you wearing flip-flops, and then you are like dressed up really nice, but you're like, you know, earning poverty level, but nobody wants to talk about that because they don't want to make a change, right? It's like you start exposing all of these class problems that we have. Nobody wants to talk about it. So I think in that way, education and literature, poetry, the arts, like these are ways to try to break open these like just these dialogues where people don't want to shift. They want to stay the way the status quo. And we need to like break it open and expose all the problems. Yeah.
With respect
That's cool. Thank you. Yeah.
With respect to not wanting to talk about money, a lot of that is put on us. I mean, you hear money is the root of all evil. So that sort of makes us a little docile about money because we don't want to be evil. I know in a lot of my friends are lawyers and work for corporate America, and they were told never talk about your salary, anything of that kind of stuff. So there's a reason why we're told to do that. But there's a famous Black actor, I can't remember his name, but basically what he said was there's a fundamental difference between how whites perceive money and how Blacks perceive money. Whites see it as a source of power. And so everything they do economics with respect to empowerment. Obviously not all whites, but those whites that are in power and ruling. Blacks see money more as for pleasure, assets to wear on their ass. And so thus we don't see and try to collect money or gather wealth for power. We gather it to look nice, to have the nice car, to in essence be in debt. So now we're sitting around struggling with our money. So everything we talk about, at least how I was able to deal with this, is I would always say to myself, to what end? Education, to what end? Okay, I'll get a good job. To what end? If we stop at any of those points short of for power to free ourselves, then we've come up short. And I will be, and I'll shut up after this, I will be the first to tell you, I've gone to the best schools in America, if not the world. And education alone is not the answer. And as a Black man, the more education you get, the more threat you are to that structure out there. Especially if you don't have any power and if you're alone. So when I was trying to start a practice as a Harvard-trained eye surgeon, I'm telling you, I ran into many roadblocks because they saw that I had know-how and could effectively compete against their economics. So education alone is not the answer. It's to what end? And my education, my economics alone is not that powerful, but if we bring it together, it's much more powerful in our ability to make a change.
We have had a powerful conversation today, and I want to thank Neal and Aimee and Darlene for joining us today. For Pier-Glass Poetry Panels, I'm Stan Galloway. Look for us next time. Bye-bye.